bit different again this week, and we've decided that we're going to go live with our Q&A because there's so many questions going on right now that it seems to make more sense that I can get some questions and feedback from you. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know. And I would like to welcome Mike Clark. Mike is a lawyer with Korman Company. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I really wanted to chat today and get your perspective mainly on what's happening with the landlord and tenant situations out there right now. So much confusion, lots of talk from the government telling tenants they don't have to pay. Landlords are still thinking that they need to pay. And this is a question I'm getting all day from a whole bunch of my different clients. And people in general. What is exactly the situation? Do tenants still have to pay the rent? Why don't we just start there? So do tenants have to pay the rent?
Yes, they have to pay the rent. So what's actually going on here is the government has assured people that, you know, if you happened not to pay your rent, you're not going to be evicted, because practically speaking, what has happened is the landlord tenant board is not currently proceeding with the necessary eviction procedures, right? So just practically speaking, there is no way to enforce an eviction right now. That is not the same thing as not paying your rent. So tenants do still have an obligation to pay their rent. If they don't pay their rent, it's a debt to the landlord. It's just owed later. And, you know, it certainly wouldn't stop a landlord from serving a notice of eviction. Just the landlord can't do anything about the notice of eviction right now.
Okay, so just to be clear, so the tenant, April 1st happens, the tenant says, I can't afford it, I'm not paying. The landlord should at that point still issue an N4 is what it is, isn't it?
Well, I mean, look, is the landlord even going to be able to enforce the thing once the landlord tenant board comes back again?
Right.
I don't know. I think you'd have an uphill battle trying to argue with the landlord tenant board that you should be able to enforce that you served during the, during the COVID-19 crisis. If there's any suggestion that the landlord is using the crisis to their advantage to try and evict tenants whose rent is maybe significantly below market.
Right.
See that one happening. I'm not sure how the landlord tenant board is going to actually look at that in real life.
Yeah. Right.
Understanding the rights of the parties, I'd say you may struggle with that one. So.
Right.
So my best advice with this is it's better to get ahead of the problem. Like, you don't want to be a landlord and discover on the 1st of May, for example, tenant didn't pay the rent. How do I pay more mortgage now? You don't want to be caught out like that just all of a sudden. So, would really suggest, and I have been suggesting this to all of my landlord clients and to my tenant clients actually, is keep an open dialogue. Reach out if you are a landlord in advance. Initiate a discussion and know what's going on in your tenants' lives. Know if they've lost their jobs. Know if they, still have a job and are earning lots of money. That guy can pay. But maybe the waitress who is no longer able to work at all. She might not be able to pay right now, but she may be eligible for EI. She may be eligible for other government programs that have been announced to subsidize wages, right? So, one thing that one of my clients was doing was they were asking for half the rent as usual on the 1st of the month, and then asking for the other half of the rent when the check comes in from the government.
Okay.
So there's lots of that can be done. That's just one example, but it really is in the best interest of both landlord and tenant to work something out in advance. You also, like, the landlord tenant board is slow at the times. Can you imagine how it's going to be when this is all over and all of a sudden there's like just a tidal wave of people trying to fight things in the landlord tenant board. Like, you don't want to be there. If there's any possible way you can work out some kind of solution between the parties in advance,
Right.
it's going to save a whole lot of expense, and difficulty and frustration and all kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, all good points. I think the issue I've been seeing is that a lot of tenants are just saying, well, I'm not going to pay. And anyway, the landlord can just get mortgage deferral. So what's the problem? I don't think they realize that the landlords and everybody out there who has a mortgage understands, I'm sure at this point, if you are opting to defer the mortgage, you still have to pay it. It's just deferred. But I think there's a real misconception about that, from what I can tell, is that a lot of people think that it means you're not paying and they're giving you free mortgage payments for an indefinite period of time. So why should I have to pay the rent? And the other interesting and important point about that, as you know, is that if you defer the mortgage, you still have to pay the interest. And so, all of that is still taking place. So, and a lot of people's interest payments are higher than the mortgage payment, right? So, depending on the situation they're in. So if a tenant were to decide to, in this case, defer or say that they can't pay the rent, is there an opportunity to ask them to defer payment or a payment plan as opposed to just forgiving the rent altogether? Is there anything, there's nothing legal out there that gives any framework for that, is there? So let's say you can't pay on April and May, and as a landlord, I say, okay, well then we'll tack that onto the end or spread that over the remaining months, or what should a landlord do?
So it's really, it's case by case. I have some landlords where they are allowing the tenant to use the last month's rent deposit. Okay, but that just bumps the problem a month down the road. So it's not, in some cases it may work, but in other cases it's not going to be effective. But otherwise, you're just making a deal. Like you can pop the rent payments later on. You can double up rent payments later. But it's obviously going to be incredibly difficult for a tenant to pay a double rent payment. Realistically, you're probably looking more like a payment plan over many months, where you cut up the deferred payments into reasonably small chunks that the tenant can actually afford to pay.
Okay. And if the landlord were to go ahead and issue an N4 for non-payment, and it goes down the road and eventually they end up at the landlord and tenant board, we don't know whether that landlord will ever recoup that money. Basically, that's
correct.
That's
because the a judgment and enforcement action is not the same thing as actually getting a check in your hand. So the landlord tenant board may evict the tenant, but trying to get the rent that is owed up to that point back from the tenant later on, totally different story. And it's an expensive process, difficult process. I don't even want to get into it really. But it can potentially be very much not worth it.
Yeah, I've been there, been to the landlord and tenant board. Not a fun place to be, and it doesn't seem to really, it's like moves at a snail's pace, that's for sure. Okay, so what if you have, for example, a tenant, does it matter, first of all, whether they're on a lease or not on a lease in terms of whether or not they have to pay, or is there any difference between a lease and non-lease?
So, if your lease is expired and your tenant's month to month, for example, there's no difference. That tenancy is still governed by the terms that were in the original lease document that's expired, as well as obviously by the rules in the Residential Tenancies Act. So, there's no difference. Like, if you're living in the property, you need to pay rent for that property. It's pretty straightforward.
Oh, excellent. So another question I had about that, because I have one particular client in this situation, is they have a tenant whose lease will be ending in the next couple of months.
Okay.
At the time where we assume that, we still may not be all back to functioning society.
Yeah.
They want to then sell the property now, as a lot of people I think will, and would prefer the tenant not to be there in order to sell the property, for obvious reasons. Can that tenant refuse to move out? So it's not an eviction, but it is the end of the lease is coming, or do the regular rules just apply? Can the landlord ask for it to be vacant upon selling the property in these times right now?
Yes, of course. So all the rules still apply. The only thing that's not applying is there's no enforcement of anything.
Okay.
Right? So if you can't enforce your contract, like there's also evictions, just one part of the contracts, right? Like non-payment of rent, can't enforce it. Landlord refuses to maintain the property, can't enforce it. Like you can't do anything right now. So
Right.
that's so critical for people to speak to each other and just be like reasonable, sensible people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to answer your question directly, if you've sold the property and the tenant refuses to leave, you literally can't do anything about it. The tenant is just there, and your seller, if they have promised vacant possession of the property, will be in breach of contract.
Right. Okay. Now, the other big question, of course, everybody wants to know is, have you seen any problems with properties closing right now? And do you anticipate any properties not closing because of what's going on?
Okay, so I mean, very, very broadly, I just want to say that everything is closing. So everything is closing. And I know you and I were chatting just before this that, there's little issues with everything, but that's to be expected. It's, everything that I've encountered so far has been, reparable. So it's little stuff. It's things like, keep in mind that every party involved in transactions up to this point has had processes that have been in place for, in the case of lawyers, like decades upon decades of the same documents that, everything happens the same way. You cut physical checks and you put them back and forth between law firms. You send keys by courier back and forth between law firms. People come into the office a couple of times to, sign documents, pick up keys, drop off keys, this kind of thing. And all of a sudden you can't do that anymore.
Right.
So, all of a sudden you can't have that face-to-face meeting. So, keep in mind when that happens, if you're not signing face-to-face, maybe you don't have the pen to paper signatures on the same piece of paper. Well, what if you have a bank that's expecting to see my signature and the client's signature on the same piece of paper?
Right.
I then have to go to the bank and I have to work out a deal to allow the bank to accept, say, a pile of paperwork with my signatures on them, and then a totally different pile of paperwork with the client's signatures on them, so that the client and I do not have to be in the same room with each other, touching the same pieces of paper, so on and so forth, right? So that's just an example of, there are so many moving parts in a real estate transaction. They are so complicated, despite being happens all the time, that one little thing goes off, and it causes a problem. But to reassure people, these deals are still closing. It's just everybody has to cooperate. You have to be more reasonable in doing things. Like a client may not have a printer at home. Well, guess what? You might have to go buy one. Because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and but just because you can't leave your house doesn't mean that the contract is on hold. The contract to buy the new house is still going. So if you don't close, you cannot use COVID-19 as an excuse. The current situation is not built in to these real estate contracts. When they were written, they did not account for this kind of unexpected situation. There's no, there's no real shall we say, teeth to
Mhm.
um, to these complaints that, oh, I just couldn't go sign it. I couldn't go to the bank to get my money
Right.
because of this, that, or the other thing. It's like a too bad, so sad situation.
Yeah.
So people really have to work together and do everything they can possibly do to make the transactions actually go through. But so far, I've seen everything has gone through. Um, I'd add
Having
that,
a little bit more flexibility is important, having
yeah,
a little bit more patience,
exactly.
keeping the lines of communication open no matter what we're talking about here seems to be the key component.
Oh yeah, it's really just about talking to people and
Mhm.
working out a deal. Like everyone, as part of the transaction, is having to deal with a change in their own process.
Yes.
It's not just one party; it's everybody. So,
Yeah.
just because of that, I think people do understand. When one person is saying, "Look, I'm having a big problem with." Delivering keys. I'm, just got back from Florida and I'm on mandatory quarantine. Can't leave my house. Sorry.
Right.
Um,
Right.
well, guess what? We have door to door couriers. So
Yeah.
I can get a courier to go to the house, pick up the keys, bring them back. Um, but then maybe the person who's picking up the keys doesn't want to come in and like meet somebody at an office. No problem. Realtors have lock boxes, right?
Right.
So keys can be left in lock boxes. Couriers can take the keys back and forth. There's still ways to kind of make everything happen. You just have to be a little bit creative, think like outside the box a little bit, and
Yeah.
the deal will get done. And tell you really, I've had, let's see, um, I don't think I've had one that fell apart specifically because of the current crisis. They were on the rocks before the crisis hit. Now,
Right. Right.
whatever chance the parties had of closing before vanished with the crisis.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I've had that kind of deal fall apart, but that's not your normal deal.
No, I guess the other thing I was thinking is that potentially you've got, a situation where, let's say it's set to close end of May,
Mhm.
buyers lose their jobs in the meantime and
Yeah.
can't get financing for some reason. And we did speak with Steve Garganis last week of Mortgage Architects, and he was explaining that, the chances are you're probably still going to get the mortgage, but there might be the instance where you can't get a mortgage. All of a sudden, they can't get the funding. And I wonder if there'll be situations like that come up, but I it doesn't sound
Absolutely. There
anticipate
will.
that.
It's going to happen to someone.
Yeah,
And again, for the most part, when it's a situation that's looking like it's temporary,
yeah,
um, business is great for this person. They just
mhm,
aren't allowed to open the door right now. Something
right,
like that, right? So the bank's like, well, you haven't earned any money in 3 months, so we can't give you a mortgage. Something along
right,
these lines. But
yeah,
the expectation is as soon as doors are open again, back comes the business, everything's good again. For a
right,
person like that, um, there's a really good argument to be made to like both sides of the agreement to extend the deal on some terms. Uh,
yeah,
you know, sellers, they don't want to have to resell the property, particularly not at a time when realistically they're not going to be able to do showings. This kind of thing is more difficult. They don't want to take the risk that they sell the property for less and then have to try to sue the buyer and afterwards. And it'll just be a mess. So, the easiest thing to do is often to extend the deal, and but you just have to have there has to be a reason to do it.
mhm,
Situation where people have lost their jobs and there's no, shall we say, light at the end of the tunnel on that
right, right.
story. Then we're realistically looking to terminate the contract. You know, the least painful way we can negotiate. But again, that's not always possible.
Mhm.
But it's certainly on a case by case basis because there's where there's a will, there's a way to, like, just because you can't get a mortgage from Royal Bank of Canada or Bank of Montreal or something like that, it doesn't mean that there isn't another lender out there who would take your particular circumstances into account and
Right.
maybe structure the deal a little bit differently to get you the money that you need to close.
And that is great to hear, because I think there's probably a lot of people in fear right now that they're probably caught in this middle situation. They've,
Yeah.
you know, they've bought something and they've also all of a sudden lost their position and they don't know what to do.
Yeah, or being temporarily laid off and they don't know when they're going back, and they don't know,
Right.
like, are they going to be able to afford the monthly mortgage payments initially, like this kind of thing, right? So it's absolutely happening, and really, again, got to talk to people.
Yeah.
Don't hide under a rug. It's you've got to go speak to the lawyer, speak to the mortgage broker, and see what can be done, because virtually all of these problems can be solved right now. It's still possible to fix just about anything.
Excellent.
Like I had a problem where the person passed away. That can't be fixed. They're dead.
Right. Right.
But barring something that extreme,
Right.
there's definitely possibilities, and it's really just about reaching out to the correct professionals. Don't if you've got a problem, you can't just walk into your local branch of your personal
Right.
bank
Yeah.
and expect them to solve this problem for you, because big banks are slaves to processes, slaves to lists and procedures and things like this. If you don't fit into the little box that they have created for you, like their hands are tied. They can't give you not allowed to bend their internal rules for the most part. Here and there they can do little things, but they if they've got some checklist and you can't fulfill the items on the checklist, guess what? You're going to have problems.
Right.
But a different lender might have a different checklist, right? So that's why it's so critical to speak to mortgage brokers as well, as well as lawyers, and to just send your mortgage application out to lots of different potential lenders, because there's also short-term solutions, right? There are lenders who will give you a mortgage for 6 months. It'll be really expensive,
right?
But get the deal done, and then you can refinance later when everything's fine.
Right, and that's a good option too. Something people should know.
Just keep it in the back of your mind. Like where there's a will, there's a way. There's some way to get the deal done. You've just got to go the extra steps.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good. That's the message for our meeting today. Where there's a will, there's a way. I like that. Okay, anything else that we should know that you can think of mentioning about, anything regarding to the landlord and tenant situation, or anything regarding closings that's important to point out?
So, I mean, one of the things that I am finding is like, if you've got a real estate transaction coming up, it's complicated. There's going to be a lot of documents to sign, and we can't necessarily use DocuSign. We can't necessarily use the great technology that exists in the world that everybody else seems to be able to use.
Right.
The legal profession and banks, they're just not there.
Right.
So, I can sign people up using a program like this. So that now counts as an in-person signing as far as the law society.
Okay. That's good.
But sign isn't the same thing as signing pen to paper.
Right.
So, at least not for the law.
Right.
So, what I would encourage people to do is, if you do have a transaction coming up, or you've got even a refinance transaction, anything like this, buy a printer. Buy a printer with a good scanner on it. They don't cost. I just bought one. I bought a great one, like office grade. I think it was $250. It has a high-speed scanner, like loading thing. It's large and hideous, and does not look good in my apartment.
Right.
But,
Not a piece of furniture.
I will be able to use it. Like, if I have to work at home and it's impossible for me to come into the office, fortunately it's still possible for me to come. I can use it. I can rely on it to get things done. And so, like, that is key. You need to have the technology at your disposal to be able to get this done, because there's no, oh, well, I'll just come meet you for an hour.
Right.
Doesn't
Yeah.
work. Door's
It's
locked.
been over for a while. Yeah.
You know, it's been over for quite some time now. And so that's even in like an emergency situation. It's not,
Yeah.
you can't use, oh, well, you know, I couldn't meet my lawyer to sign the documents as an excuse not to close. You're just in breach of contract because it's really easy. Like if you're paying $1.5 million for a house, you can buy a $250 printer scanner.
Right.
You know, with the exceptions of people who just, you know, for whatever reason are never realistically going to be able to sort the technology out. For everybody else, you know, it'll make your life so much easier. You'll be able to get the transaction done. You know, that's fine. And all you have to do is buy an extra printer.
And Staples and Best Buy deliver in a day.
Yeah, exactly. Like you know, that Best Buy was going to deliver it to me, but it was going to take them 5 days. So, you know, I just went up to one of their locations and you just line up outside you go into the store one at a time and they just hand you the box and then you pay right there with tap.
It works.
It was really easy, and I was able to get my printer, you know, within 24 hours of ordering it online. So, you know, it's easy to do. So that would be one of my suggestions there, just for people, because they're going to need it for so many things. Maybe they need it to sign their deal.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe they need it to sign the mortgage paperwork. Maybe they need it to cancel maybe they have to sign something to cancel a utility contract, right? Like there's so many things where normally we just take it for granted that we can print something out and sign it at work. You don't notice like the times where now that you're stuck at home and you can't go into the office, well, it could just be one document.
Right.
That one document could make or break the entire deal. That's the situation we're in right now. So, you know, I think it does, it would help to have a printer and scanner. Printer and scanner at home. Another thing that I would just mention is, you know, we talked about residential tenancies. Commercial tenancies.
Yes.
There's no landlord tenant board that's not enforcing to protect you right now.
Okay.
If you've got a commercial tenancy, if you're either the commercial tenant or the commercial landlord. So that, you know, it is business as usual for the most part for commercial tenancies. If you don't pay the rent, you're in breach of contract. The landlord can get a locksmith in there and lock those doors and basically distrain all of your stuff. You know, like it's potentially not good. So again, actually, it's almost doubly important to have an open line of communication between commercial landlords and commercial tenants. You know, again, there's ways to get around this. Like one of my clients, he's a big commercial landlord. He's got, you know, lots of buildings, lots of tenants. And he's just made a deal. Like he just said, right up front, he took the last month's rent. If he had 2 last months' rent, there's still 1 left. And he'll take that later. And then postpone, you know, the replacement of that last month's rent. In other cases, he is allowing the tenants to pay the taxes, the maintenance, and the insurance only, and skip the actual component of rent that is separate from the expenses of running the building.
Okay.
Just very quickly, commercial tenancies often have 2 chunks of rent. Instead of just paying 1 payment per month, you actually pay 2. One pays for the rent, the other one pays for all of the costs, because commercial landlords are allowed to pass on costs that residential landlords would not necessarily be able to.
Right.
But, you know, again, it's being creative. Reduce rent for a while. Some landlords are giving rent holidays. Some landlords are just completely forgiving rent, just saying, don't pay. It's okay. I like your business. I want you to stay. I want you to be successful in the future. You know, but it really depends on the situation of each landlord. Like these landlords have huge mortgages to pay.
Right.
Buildings. And let me tell you, commercial banks are not being very helpful.
Right.
Like they will be helpful, but only like in the absolute, as a last ditch effort.
Right.
So
Yeah.
because it's not like you're being kicked out of your home, right? you're being kicked out of a commercial space.
Right.
For a lot of people with commercial spaces, you can go rent another one. It's many people, it's not that easy. There's a lot of money sunk into the commercial lease space, so they want to keep it and they don't want to just hand that all that renovated property back over to the landlord, who then just gets there's all sorts of things there. Of course, it can be very expensive. You don't want to give up the commercial tenancy, but that's why it's just cut a deal. Figure out how you can cut a deal. Figure out how, like, you've got to come with your numbers, right?
Yeah.
You can't just go to the landlord and say, hey, can I have a rent holiday? You have to go with your numbers, and you have to say, if you're a tenant, look, revenue is down 50%, 75%, whatever.
Right.
Here's my books. And guess what? Like, I cannot pay you, but before, here's my books from this time last year. We know how much money I can make.
Right.
So don't want me as a tenant later, but let's just work something out. As you can see, there's the cash flow. There would be expected to be cash flow in the future. So you can make a deal about, again, just paying pieces of payments for, a certain period of time to come in the future. They're spread out the pain of those missed rent payments. Because again, they're not gone. They form a debt to the landlord.
Right. Especially on the commercial side.
Especially on the commercial side. But yeah, the commercial tenants, they do have to be wary of those other landlord rights that the landlord doesn't need a court or anyone to enforce. A landlord can get a locksmith in there and change locks pretty fast.
Right.
So
Okay.
you've got to be careful about that kind of thing.
Okay, that is great advice. I have some people that'll be interested in hearing that, and that's good. Good. It's something I hadn't even really thought about, the difference between residential and commercial. Right? We're talking so much and hearing so much about residential, but of course, commercial tenants are probably even more likely to be in a bad situation. Right?
Like if the shop fronts are shut down, with the exception of very, very few places that are on the essential services list. They'll keep at least maybe a food takeout business going,
right?
Just to pay the bills. And I don't, in most cases, it's not even going to, like, I have a big restaurant client, and they just shut her down. They were like, there's no, what's the point in having all of these expensive commercial spaces? They're paying $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 a month for some location. Like, they're not paying for that with some takeout. It's like it's just impossible. Right? So some restaurants are just shutting down, and then they're relying on cash reserves, or relying on their pull as bigger tenants to be able to cut a deal with the landlord. But that's what you got to do. You got to get right. Don't wait until it's like the last second, rent's due the next day, and you don't have the money. Start now.
Yeah, good. Such great advice. Thank you so much for all of this information. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I'll make sure everyone's got your information in the feed if they want to reach out or they are in need of some legal advice.
I think it was in there. I can't see it on the end here.
Yeah, it was in there. I think we'll make sure it's there again. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. Maybe we'll have you on again in a couple of weeks and get an update. Yeah,
we'll see where we are.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Everything's still.
Yeah, everything's fine. Okay, thanks so much, Mike.
No problem. Bye, Jenelle.
Bye.